Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1.2 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode 328, brought to you by Whipper, Australia's very own pack manufacturer, we talked to Greg Keaney about a 1,600-kilometre choose-your-own adventure titled Dreamtime to Eden. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the supporters page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is hearing people's stories, and in particular, I love hearing about those that create a choose-your-own adventure, where they cobble together walks or undertake walks in a different way, all to keep it interesting. In this podcast episode, we talk with self-proclaimed saunterer Greg Keaney, who over 2 years walked along Australia's east coast from Tweed Heads near the New South Wales-Queensland border to the township of Eden close to the Victorian border. Instead of doing this walk all in one go, Greg did this walk in 1 week blocks in between his work commitments. He walked every beach and every headland almost over 80 days and 16 one-week stages. So as you go through and listen to this podcast, it'd be worth going to the show notes on the Australian Hiker website for this podcast, as it'll have some links and some images that'll put a bit of context in what we're talking about. Greg, thanks for taking the time to talk with us about your East Coast adventure.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you on your brilliant podcast, and it's one of my all-time favourites.
Okay, now before we talk about your trip, provide a bit of context and give us a bit of a background on your hiking experience.
Okay. I've always loved walking, I think as many people that grow up in Australia do, but I lived overseas for many years, so I always missed our magnificent natural areas, and especially on the coast. I actually, in my younger days, I trekked and boated across Borneo, Kalimantan, and I also lived in Brunei for 17 years, and that has lots of opportunities for exciting jungle and rainforest hiking, but it tends to be nature with a capital N, as I say. You bring your machete and you forge your own trails. I love being back in Australia where, most of the time you've got trails to follow, etc. I love all kinds of walking and hiking, so I enjoy a walk in the city or the suburbs just as much as a nice long bush walk, but there is something great about being out there. I was a Boy Scout in my youth, and I'm pretty comfortable with camping, but generally now as I age, I prefer long day walks rather than heavy pack sort of wilderness multi-day or multi-week experiences. And I live in Sydney, so the coast is my usual go-to, and Royal National Park, or I call it Republic National Park, that's my favourite day walk destination. It's just outstanding. And closer to home, I'm also a bit of a frequent flyer on the Maroubra to La Perouse walk and the Kurnell to Cronulla via Cape Solander walks, which are all equally magnificent. And as well as all of that, I love to ride through the bush on my mountain bike, and that opens up a lot of other areas for exploration that are either, on fire trails or management trails, but end up in great destinations.
Okay, that's good. I mean, that there are areas that I've been trying to get up to for a couple of years, and then I found the floods, then COVID sort of impacted, but certainly over the next year or so, I plan to get out and do a lot of the walks you're talking about. So looking forward to it.
Well, if you ever want a local guide, please get in touch.
No worries, thank you. So over the last 2 years, you walked 1,600 kilometres from Tweed Heads, just on the New South Wales-Queensland border, all the way to the southern New South Wales town of Eden. What prompted you to do this trip?
It's sort of hard to recall exactly from the depths of time. I quite often get asked that question, and I think the genesis perhaps was I went on a few surfing safaris in my teens, and on one of those a mate had just got his licence and he wanted to drive to every beach. So we did quite a few. And then I think we gave up as teenagers are wont to do when we realised that there was 892 official beaches in New South Wales. But much more recently, when we were all restricted to our states during COVID and everybody was complaining and whinging and what will we do, I just thought, well, what sort of travel would I do if that were the case for the rest of my life? And I simply sat down one morning in a cafe and the person I was meeting was late. And I just sort of looked at the route on Google Maps and saw that there was a lot of yellowy coloured sand and a lot of greeny coloured bush. And I thought, oh, that looks pretty doable. And then I trialled the concept over the summer of 21-22, which was still sort of a bit of COVID restrictions in place. And I walked all the Sydney beaches with my brother from Palm Beach to Cronulla as a series of day walks. And that was fascinating. Even in a city that I know very well, it was just great to have the discipline of every beach, every headland. And I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought I want a lot more of this.
Yeah, it's funny, really. I think it doesn't matter where you live in Australia or the world, for that matter. Quite often it tends to be, let's go interstate or let's go overseas, and you tend to not think about what's in your local area. And I can remember when I did the Manly to Bondi walk or Bondi to Manly walk, there are areas that I had never seen before in Sydney, and I think there was a lot of people in Sydney who don't tend to know those walks exist. So it's good when you set yourself a goal to say, well, let's go through and do these. And you see areas that you may have been living near for years that you've never been to before.
Exactly. I mean, my next sort of big project is to walk all the foreshores of Sydney Harbour, and 321 kilometres. I mean, who knew? But it's exactly the same. If you just sort of, I don't know, have a little rule and just get out, throw a few sandwiches in a day pack, and just, I really love that. And I think you can't always be on the trails in Nepal or South America or whatever, but you can always find a little adventure very close to home.
That sounds interesting. Actually, again, you do look at Sydney Harbour, and it's a funny sort of harbour where there's lots of little jagged bits sticking in and out. And when, as you say, you put a ruler over it on a straight line, you don't realise how big that foreshore actually is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was sort of thinking a lot on this coast walk about, well, what would it be like before there were bridges and crossings and ferries and things. And I read something where they were interviewing some Indigenous folk asking about the coastal trails, and some elders said, well, we wouldn't have walked on the coast because you'd get to these barriers that would be impossible. We'd always walk, sort of in the lower mountain ranges, because that's where the rivers and creeks and lakes, etc., would be crossable.
Yeah. I suppose it's probably a bit easier now. I think not maybe in all instances, but I'm guessing there's probably a fair number of either walking bridges or roads that you might have to cut inland for, but you'd be able to get a continual hike one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting back to the Tweed to Eden walk, which you've gone through and called it the Eden to Dreamtime walk, and I'll talk more about the name in a moment. Did you follow the existing trails, or was this a combination of existing trails, you had to create connection points, and have a small section of off trail or coming onto the roads as you went?
So I've mentioned that my rule of thumb was every beach and every headland. But as a guiding principle, I wasn't completely fundamentalist about it. But as far as possible, I walked on the beaches or as close to the ocean as possible. In many places, there are trails sort of in the swale behind the dunes, but I just love the sound of the ocean and the rolling waves, so I rarely use that alternative. I think if you look at a map of New South Wales, when you combine all the sort of name tracks such as Yirrigir and Tamari and Royal National Park and Kiama Coastal Walk and Murrumarang and Ulladulla Headlands and Munjip and Minji Dreaming Trail and Wharf to Wharf and Kangarootha Track. And then you combine that with all the walking trails in settled areas like, as you mentioned, Bondi to Coogee or, the Bondi to Manly Walk. I'd say at least 80% of the coast and perhaps more is set up for very uncomplicated either beach or trail walking. And the other 20% says there are some long beaches. There's the occasional quiet road. Often they're just fire trails or four-wheel drive access roads. And there was just a couple of areas on the far south coast where you may need to return to the Princes Highway for a few kilometres. For example, around Rosedale Beach.
Yeah.
And that's often just where there's a section of privately held land. And I didn't put in enough planning to sort of contact owners and ask, can I get permission to walk across the land? But really, it's all very, very, very doable. And in the few places where it isn't, there's often a local bus. You've just got to be aware of the bus times, and you can just catch the bus sort of, inland to the town where a bridge is located, and catch the bus out to the next bit the next day.
Okay, no, that's good. Now, getting back to the name, Dreamtime to Eden, which is what you've called your walk. Where did that name come from?
So Dreamtime Beach is actually about the third or fourth most northern beach in New South Wales. If you can imagine the Tweed River, there's actually two beaches to the north of the Tweed, because the New South Wales-Queensland border is the watershed. So it's sort of, in a sense, it's the northern side of the Tweed River. And then on the south side, there's a long spit of land called Letitia Spit, and that runs down to a place called Fingal Bay, Fingal Head, and Dreamtime Beach is the immediate next beach. And it's my poor attempt at sort of amateur poetry that I love the sound of Dreamtime and I love the sound of Eden, and they seem to combine a little bit of, real Indigenous Australia combined with a little bit of the Western import of Eden. So it just seemed to have a nice ring to it. And once I started calling it that, it's just the name has sort of stuck with me when I explain the walk to people.
Okay. I must admit I had some sort of romantic idea that the name had come from somewhere, and not that there was actually a beach called Dreamtime. So
yeah, well, that's right. So I was kind of, I always have to explain it if I'm contacting a magazine or something saying Dreamtime Beach near Tweed Heads on the New South Wales-Queensland border sort of thing. But it's like it when you have an unusual name, it just sticks in your head and you want to keep it that way.
Now, the next key decision in choosing how to do your walk is the direction of travel. You headed south. Why was that?
So I think often when you look at advice in walking in our part of the world, the sort of main practical reason is that you have the sun on your back for most of the day. And also I did find that the breezes tend to be either nor'easters in the summer or westerlies in the winter. So it's on the best days you have the sun on your back and the wind, comfortable breeze just blowing you along. But that being said, I did have a fair few days of walking into southerlies, which is sometimes nice when you're very hot, but can get unpleasant when you're walking at the full force of one. And and I was also a bit more familiar with the north coast and the south, and so I kind of thought not so much saving the best for last, but saving the places I really didn't know well for last.
Instead of doing this walk in a single trip, you broke it down into weekly blocks. Tell us why you chose to do it in this way and how long it took you to complete this adventure.
Yeah, so I love reading about folk who do those amazing long walks, and I think it would just be incredible to have that block of time to do things like the Bibbulmun track. But I wanted to integrate it with my normal life. I also want to make these things as accessible as possible. I still work, so I work in chunks, so I did find it very easy to just do it in weekly stages. And also for much of the trip, my wife, she accompanied me on parts of it, but she was working, and so it also meant not being away from home for too long at a time. I also write and speak about a concept I call micro, which is sort of the medium, middle Goldilocks way, big enough to be meaningful, but small enough to be actually doable by mere mortals. And so in between those macro climb Mount Everest type challenges and the micro go for an afternoon ones, I think there's a lot of space for something like this structured this way. And then as I've written more and more about it along the way, I found there's actually a large segment of folks who really love walking, like all of us do, but they shy away from those ones that say, take a year off and it's all very difficult and very challenging and you're scaling vertical cliffs, etc. So, I found it really worked well. And as a matter of fact, now that I've completed it, I kind of miss not having the next stage to plan and, look at another little section of the coast in detail.
Well, it sounds like you planned upcoming Sydney adventure whenever you get around to it. Sounds like it'll keep you busy for a few days at least.
Yeah, well, I'm a very avid sort of public transport user, and what I love about this walk, initially I did it completely unsupported, and I just used to fly on a cheapy Jetstar flight or get the train or get the bus, and I love that. And the Sydney walk, that's very much when I write about it, it'll be everything can be done, getting somewhere by bus or by ferry or by train. So that is a real attraction of this walk. You're never really far away from a public transport connection.
Yeah, that's certainly helpful. It makes a big difference when you can go through and access transport without having to rely on somebody to drop you off and then come and pick you up at the other end. It's okay when you're close to home, but going from Sydney to Tweed, being dropped off, it's probably better to, as you say, get a bus or a train or a flight up there, and as you get closer to home, get dropped off or public transport, as you say.
Yeah, and I also think it surprised me how many people want to do things, but they just need that extra level of reassurance. So I'm just writing an article at the moment about walking the sort of coastal walk from Newcastle to Sydney. And I think one of the big attractions there is if you get tired, well, okay, you just walk a kilometre or so to the nearest bus stop, and there's sort of buses all along the way. So I think that is a bigger advantage for especially a group of people where you're not sure. Some are great walkers, some are a bit nervous. If you can just say, well, if we're getting tired, we can just stop halfway and wait for the next bus.
Yeah, no, that's good. Now let's look at logistics. What was the accommodation on this trip? And again, what was the reason for choosing the option that you did?
So, I mean, we're so blessed. There are many, many outstanding national park camping options almost all along the coast. And then, of course, there are caravan parks in almost every coastal town. So anybody wanting to do it with a tent, it would be very straightforward. There's maybe 2 or 3 bits where you just have to think a bit about provisions, but nothing that anybody that's used to hiking in the mountains wouldn't be able to well and truly plan. But I mentioned earlier, I think I prefer a solid rather than a canvas roof, so I actually didn't camp anywhere along the way. I stayed in a mixture of hostels, hotels, motels, caravan park cabins, and then occasionally we booked an Airbnb for longer stays. That was, if I had a support crew, so we could sort of base ourselves somewhere. For me personally, it's just a great advantage not having to carry all the additional gear required for camping: tent, sleeping bag, sleeping mat, cooking gear, and food, etc. Because I think when you've got the heavy pack, it affects some decisions. Things like walking around a rock ledge, or often on the walk, there's out and back tracks out to a headland, and they might add 3 to 5 kilometres onto your journey. I think because I had a light pack, I was very keen to, touch base at the tip of every headland, and I was much more likely to do that without all the gear. But that being said, the camping possibilities are astonishing, and indeed so much of the coast is so isolated that wild camping would be very easy in many, many, many places, and there just wouldn't be a human being around to know you'd ever been there.
How did you manage your food on this trip? Was it a carry your food for the day and have breakfast and lunch at your accommodation, or were you carrying everything, or were you buying in towns and where you were staying?
So usually I just buy the food in towns along the way. So it depended a little bit on which stage. Some parts of the walk, you don't even have to think about it. There are a few areas, such as around Mile Lakes, where I, would have thought, even though I'm being, a cabin in a caravan park, that caravan park is 18 kilometres from the nearest shop, etc. So in those places, I just carry a couple of dehydrated meals. I'm not a real breakfast eater, so I would just often just, carry a couple of boiled eggs or a few oranges and nuts for food during the day, and then have a good meal in the late afternoon, early evening. I'm a very early starter, so I generally started walking at sunrise. And one tip I would give to anybody who's thinking of doing it, particularly in sort of places like Urigia, even though there might be a general store in a small town, they often close quite early, 3 or 4 p.m. So it is worth checking hours, especially if you're camping and you're relying on such a place for provisions.
Yeah, you tend to assume that shops are open from 9 till 5 at least, maybe a bit earlier or a bit later. But it's a bit of a culture shock when you think, oh, hang on a sec, they've closed because they're really quiet. And we've got a shop in our local area that closes outside the school holidays, and it's like, oh, they're obviously busy at certain times of the year. The other times they just shut up shop.
Yeah, well, I was reading about somebody on the Great North Walk who was, dreaming about, I think it was at Summersby, getting to the little shop along the way, but it was Boxing Day or something and the shop was closed. But I stayed in some accommodation attached to the general store in Tweed Heads, which is on the Urrugia Walk. And I think I sort of checked in around 2:30 and I went to the shop, let's say 2:55, and the owner was in a hurry because she was just going to close up and pick up her kids from school and go to the beach. But I had no idea, but I was just very lucky. I was, came at 2:55, not 3:05. But generally speaking, the hours nowadays, with the internet and people post those things, I found it pretty reliable. And I also have to say that the quality of what's available was a real surprise. Back in my youth, there'd just be a few tin goods, but particularly in Broomhead and Mini Water, the shops were as good as anything you'd find in the middle of Sydney or Melbourne. They had a really good range of gourmet food and nice, if you wanted to buy sort of takeaway or cooked food, nice selection too.
What gear did you need to bring on your walk? Was it just stock standard hiking gear or a change of clothes, or was there anything special?
Yeah, so in the first 3 stages where I was carrying everything, of course, I'd have a bit of a change of clothes. I think really beyond what everybody would know they'd need to bring, sun protection is a very big thing. Obviously, you're out in sort of fairly open country a lot of the time. And I think the very first or the first 2 days, it was winter and I just wore a T-shirt. And I don't really normally think about sun protection on my arms. But after that, I very quickly learned, you need a long sleeve top, thin one if it's getting hot. I did have a sort of a kangaroo pouch in that top, which I found really useful just for my phone. I take a lot of photos and also occasionally checking the map. And I made sure I applied sunscreen to the sort of top of my knees and the back of my calves because the sun is sort of on either overhead or on your back. And I bought one of those sort of hats with a neck covering, I call them the Foreign Legion coverings.
Yep.
And I did find that pretty useful, again, just to make sure your neck wasn't it's always like one little spot you forget about that where the sunburn happens. And on cooler days, I just wore a pair of those sort of long, tight compression style leggings. And I mean, that's just my preference. I just found that they're quick drying. If you just want to walk across a little creek or lagoon and you couldn't be bothered taking your boots and trousers off, that made they're very quick drying. So that made it a lot easier. And also there are just a very few little bits where the headland tracks aren't very well tended. So you get that sort of spiky coastal scrub, which can really grab on any clothes that are close to the ground. And then for me personally, I loved having a thermos. That meant I could just watch every day's sunrise with coffee in hand. I didn't have to think about preparing anything except for filling the thermos before I left wherever I was staying. And then there's quite a few river, creek and icole, intermittently closed and open lakes and lagoons along the way. And most of those are easily wadeable. Really depends. They sort of close and open, and sometimes ones that I thought would be closed turned out to be a swim, and others that I was a bit worried about, for example, near the mouth of Shoalhaven, and I was expecting a big long swim and it just turned out to be a sandbar. So those ones you have to take them into account, and most of them have nearby bridges or easily booked boat transport. But every now and again, when you've got a swim, I actually used a thing called a ruck raft, which is really just something like a life ring that you can put your pack on. I just found the swimming in currents was a bit easier with that rather than the garbage bag method where you've sort of only really got, you're sort of kicking along with your feet. But it's quite disconcerting if all of a sudden you're in a 2 or 3 knot current, when you're just kicking along, you can float a long way very quickly.
So, but otherwise, now, were you wearing boots or trail runners, or what were you wearing footwear-wise?
I wore low-cut hiking boots, and I think trail runners would be absolutely fine for most of it. The further south you go, the rocks, it's sort of, when you're in the Sydney sandstone or Hawke's River sandstone country, generally the rocks are smooth. I did find, sort of south of Kiama, you're quite often on a sharpish rock shelf. So you just need to make sure that the soles aren't those sort of very soft rubber soles that, if you're stepping on, shale or, kind of rock with sharp edges. It's just nice to have something. So I think low-cut hiking boots are great. I think you've got to remember that you're taking your shoes off and on, and it's actually very good practice, I found, to avoid blisters, to every time you have a bit of a break to take your shoes and socks off and air your feet. But there was nothing really that special. Water, generally it's good. I used to just have like a fairly big, a sort of 1.5 litre bottle, but I did have a sort of a 2 litre bladder, those things you get in that cyclists had used to drink from. So if I was not sure about the water situation, I'd also fill that one up. So 3.5 litres will get you quite a long way.
So speaking of water, was water readily accessible? I mean, particularly if you're going through public beaches, you'd expect there to be water sources. But how did you go water-wise? Were you, when you were in the more remote areas, were you filtering off water systems, or how were you managing that?
I wasn't. I think it's sort of, perhaps to have a packet of purification tablets in your pack, especially if people are camping. You do have to think about it, because quite a lot of the national park camp areas might have tank water, but that would not be, the signs at least say it's not drinkable. I didn't face any real issues. As I mentioned before, many, many places, a day's walk, you'd be passing a couple of small towns, and I was never in town where there wasn't a park with drinkable water. So it's only Mile Lakes area is probably the one area you've got to be pretty careful about. And then sometimes if you're doing it in the summer or in hotter weather, the long, long beaches up north, you can get sort of 10, 15 kilometres of isolated beach without any water sources along it. Sometimes there's sort of the backing lagoon or a creek or a watercourse runs parallel to the beach. So, you can't get across and the road will be further inland. But really, I've got detailed information on my blog, but really it's not an issue. And I'd say out of the 16 weekly sections I did, there was only maybe 2 or 3 of those where there were days where you'd have to sort of think about carrying the extra water.
Okay. Now that's a logical point to talk about. What was your typical day look like for this adventure? Now, I know, given you, 79, 80 days, I think, all up?
Yeah.
Yeah, and, 1,600 kilometres, the days are certainly going to vary, but did you have a standard get-up time and finish time? And typically, what were your logistics for each typical day?
Yeah, so look, it's funny. I've seen your thing on the Bibbulmun track, and you kind of get into a rhythm when you're doing these walks. And I'm always an early riser, so typically I'd get up about an hour before sunrise. I'd make some coffee for my thermos, and then I just tried always to be on my way at first light. So just as the sort of the first rays of daylight are creeping above the horizon. And that was an advantage of not needing to break camp, because then I could always or almost always pick my spot for a perfect sunrise, which was just an absolute bonus of each day of the walk. I'd often just sort of, once I got to the sunrise spot, just sit and enjoy it. And I'm not a real woo guy, but I guess sort of half meditate, half enjoy, just drink in everything, the beauty of the sunrise every day. And then I'd get walking probably around 6:37, I guess, as an average, sort of the sun has risen and the day has begun. And then my usual method, decided somewhere along the way, was I'll explore everything, backtracks, interesting rock shells, unusual side tracks, etc., until I had my lunch. And then after lunch and knowing that, I'd have to get to somewhere, I'd sort of try and a bit more and stick to the plan. So I'd sort of be much more open in the mornings. And I guess I'm a bit of a morning guy anyway. And I'm a slow sauntering type of walker. And I took many, many breaks along the way, which I also think was why I didn't get any sort of stresses or injuries. And it's actually just so beautiful that you've got to stop and drink it all in. You just don't want to rush through. And so I'd probably stop at every headland and every hour along the beaches. And sometimes there'd just be a nice spot to stop. So I'd just stop there even though I didn't need a rest. And then as for the length of a typical day, I guess if you divide 1,600 by 80, it's about 20 kilometres. And I probably averaged, with all the breaks, only about 2 to 3 kilometres per hour. So I guess starting walking at 7 and I'd get somewhere about 3, and then I'd check in, have a shower, drink a beer or two, and post a daily recount to Facebook, which I've actually found to be an excellent journal. I always used to sort of handwrite a journal, but I've got to admit I've upgraded to using Facebook for that purpose now, and it's a great place to sort of put the photos and share everything, and then dinner and early to bed and rinse and repeat.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say it's the sort of thing you do get into a routine, whatever sort of hike you're doing, you do get into a routine. And I'm an early riser as well, so I prefer to be up and going. If I'm awake, I'm not just lying in bed. I've got to go. So being able to say, as you say, without having to pack away tents and things like that, just being able to sort of, you're up, you're going. As soon as first light's there, you're on your way. So it's a good way to do it.
And it's just such a magical part of the day everywhere, but especially on our East Coast where the sun's coming up over the water, everything's still, the bird life. It's incredible the whole day, but around sunrise, especially when you're on these isolated headlands by yourself, you just feel you're sort of at one with everything.
Now, navigation. Was the navigation for this walk pretty easy, or were there some sticky spots along the way?
Overall, very easy. I'm probably a little bit slack about that, but I just use Google Maps as my main navigation aid on the walk. I found that really, really, really good. It was sometimes just not perfect, but most of the time, even with your phone off, the satellite pings will still show your location. And generally, you're walking north to south, so the ocean's on your left, the land's on your right. It's pretty straightforward. There are just a few times where, you can't just go on maps perfectly. And it was a couple of times a bit of a problem for me that on Google Maps and other mapping software, it'd show a wide, flat stretch of nice beach sand. And then I'd actually get there and it'd be a set of rocky cliffs, sort of all the sand had washed away, due to all the erosion by the past few years of East Coast lows. So that's the only thing. But there's no easy way to really find out the local conditions until you get there. And if I just thought it was impassable, I'd look for alternatives. And again, Google Maps was pretty good. I did at my desk, I'd look on things like All Trails, the National Park site especially. And then there's a site, I don't know if you know of it, the New South Wales Government Spatial Services has a satellite map which you can really zoom into. But again, you've got to be careful that it's not like, instantly updated all the time. So it might show something to be much more straightforward than it is.
I agree. I do use that spatial website. So it is quite handy, particularly when you're dealing with areas that are a bit more remote or a bit more out of the normal.
Yes, and sort of on a big computer screen, I find you can really zoom in. The detail is great. And even if you're not sure, something on Google Maps might just be green land, but on that spatial one, it'll indicate property boundaries, etc. So I could find out, is that something I've got to ask permission for, or is that something I can just walk through? But to be honest, I did get a bit slacker as time went on. Because so much of it was so straightforward and intuitive, I probably should have paid a bit more attention to one or two of the tricky bits. So to give you an example, there's a new track from the headland just north of Eden down to Ashlings Beach. And I'd read that it was there, so I thought, it's no problem, I'll find it. But I actually missed it. And then locals in Eden told me, you just had to look. You sort of had to go 100 metres or so off the fire trail to the start of the track, and I just had completely walked by. And then there's another area around Bunga Head, from Bunga Head to sort of Mimosa Rocks. And I'd read something on Facebook that a bushwalking group had gone through. They did say it was a bush bash, but I thought that it would either be easy to follow or there'd be pink ribbons or something like that. But I couldn't find the way. It was getting dark. It's a steep headland, and when you get to the top of the rise, you can see a big swamp, and probably the track was a bit further inland. But I just retreated because it was just, the 2D map made it look very easy and only a couple of kilometres. But in reality, when you're there and you're by yourself, it was a case of discretion being the better part of valour. But really, I think for 95% of the walk, the navigation is very intuitive. There's a track at the end of the beach, at the southern end of the beach, if you're walking north to south. If it looks like the headland is super steep, then probably the track just starts a little bit earlier. You can see a saddle, or you can see the headland, where there'd be a logical place for a track.
That's true. You sort of sometimes when it's a designated walk and it's a well-known walk, you often see a lot of signage. Other times, the signage could be a bit better.
Well, funnily enough, it's actually, for people who are really strict on following the trail, it's sometimes more confusing in national parks or, sort of reservation areas where there's lots and lots and lots of tracks. I sort of didn't really mind if I took the wrong turn and walked out somewhere. I just figured, well, that'll be nice. I'll see what that headland looks like. But again, Google Maps, when you zoom in satellite view with the location ping on, you often can work out which track it would be. Although one thing I would say is it's very handy to download, if you're using Google Maps, download the offline version so it's available even when you're in flight mode. Sometimes if you're not, you'll find all the detail disappears.
Yeah. But
all of that being said, I think if I was just setting out to do it again, I'd use the resource of local bushwalking clubs more often. Quite often I'd meet walkers sort of after I'd been stuck somewhere, and they'd say, our group did that. And everybody's so generous in this sort of hiking and bushwalking community that I think to simply send an email, to the Bateman's Bay bushwalkers, somebody will get back to you if you're asking. And indeed, whenever anybody contacts me through my website about, what's it like swimming across, near Tourist Heads or something, I always answer as soon as I can, because I realise that they're going to have a great time and I can kind of enjoy their trip vicariously, thinking about that little stretch of the walk.
Whipper is an Australian designer and manufacturer of ultralight packs based in the Blue Mountains town of Katoomba, and manufactures the best purpose-built performance packs for use in hiking, mountaineering, climbing and canyoning. Leveraging Australian design and manufacturing experience built up since 1981, Whipper uses the most advanced materials available with a minimalist approach that ensures every element serves a purpose. In doing so, they strip away the unnecessary to focus on what truly matters, which is functionality, durability, comfort and performance, to create packs that, in Whipper's words, are lighter, stronger and better. So if you want to experience your ultimate hiking adventure, then get yourself a Whipper Ultralight Performance Pack designed and built in Katoomba, Australia. Now let's look at the experience itself. So 1,600 kilometres along the east coast of Australia will see you through a large variety of landscape types. What was the mix of bush versus urban walking? And did you have a favourite section, or were there just too many to talk about?
You're probably expecting the answer, but forgive me if I say it, but every day was just perfect. There just isn't a bad day anywhere. And even in the quite settled places, the sort of urban places, for want of a better word, it's just incredible how wild and remote much of the walk feels. To give you an example, walking from Newcastle to the Central Coast, it was just astonishing. I swam with dolphins a couple of times there. And look, even in Sydney, if you're walking, for example, from Maroubra to La Perouse, you feel just as out there as many more isolated parts of the coast. So I just don't think many of us really appreciate quite what a treasure we have on our doorsteps, that when the Great North Walk was first a thing, the sort of walk a bit inland from Sydney to Newcastle, I can remember thinking, that's incredible. You can walk all the way from Sydney to Newcastle. But when I kind of came to Sydney doing this, I thought, like, you know what, I've just done the coastal Great North Walk. I've walked every beach, and the added advantage is there's superb nearby transport connections and stops for cafes and accommodation if you want them, and just no real hassles. And really, it's 9 to 10 days of unbelievable coastal walking between the two largest cities in New South Wales. And in my opinion, it's as good as any coastal walk anywhere in the world. So, but if I had to pick favourite bit, I mean, I really loved the far south coast, sort of south from Batemans Bay. And I think a lot of that was because it was pretty new to me. It is a little bit more difficult there because there are quite a few swims or water crossings, but the coastline and the geology is just incredible. And the marine life, especially the sort of sea lions, the whales and the dolphins, it just makes every day a joy. But that being said, in the north, Crowdy Bay National Park and Diamond Head, south of Laurelton, which I think the woman from Coffs Trails on your site, when she was forced into this, she recommended that, and I've got to say that was 11 out of 10. But to wrap that bit up, it's just like asking about who's your favourite child. I just loved each and every place on the walk, and I guess I should give a shout out to my two wonderful sons, Sho and Shin, and my gorgeous stepkids, Anne and John, and my four perfect grandkids, Raven, Jian, JM and Jana, who all live in the Philippines, and indeed my beautiful wife, Jelly, who accompanied me on some sections and had to put up with me raving about it for the past 2 years.
Is your wife a hiker, or she it's not her thing?
I think like as sometimes happens when you're in a good partnership, she's become a good hiker. I'm not sure it was intuitive, but she grew up in the mountains in the Philippines. So when we're there, we're often up in unbelievably beautiful country. If anybody's ever thinking of doing some hiking or mountain biking, I can thoroughly recommend the mountains of Panay, which are as high as, in the interior, they're as high as Kosciuszko, but you're in the tropics, and the walking and the mountain biking is spectacular. But you need to know how to walk on slippery tropical mud there. So yeah, she loves the hiking, but she's got different work commitments to me. So this was sort of not something that easily worked out as something we could do all the way as a couple.
That's right. Now, going the opposite, was there a least favourite section?
No, I think, as I said, there just isn't a bad day to be had. I thought, because I walk around Sydney Harbour so much, things like the Manly to Spit Walk and around the sort of inner northern suburbs of Sydney, I thought, that's pretty familiar. But I found doing it as part of this longer adventure, I actually enjoyed them equally, if not more. It was a lot of nostalgia. I grew up in Mossman, and so there's a lot of nostalgia for places. And I think when I just go there for a day walk, my mind isn't in the sort of total reflective phase. And also because I was posting each day on Facebook about it, I think because I was sort of thinking about journaling, I was paying a lot more attention to things. So they're just said above, it's just 80 perfect days, really. There just wasn't anything at all. No regrets, and absolutely, I just can't recommend it highly enough. It's just such an amazing coast.
Were there any pinch points that, problems with crossing rivers or things like that where it was a bit difficult to get around or through?
So there are a few tricky bits. There's fewer than most people imagine, and all of them have alternatives. There's a headland near Mile Lakes called Big Gibber, which sounds ominous, and it is. It's a sort of 50-metre high headland, very steep, and occasionally in years where the sand has all been washed in, I've read of somebody who walked around, but I've also read of a lot of people who have got stuck. The headland is impassable. It's backed by a deep swamp. I was speaking to a ranger there who said, there may or may not be a track. But in that case, I just used, there's a mining road which runs between Submarine Beach, which is a bit south of Seal Rocks, and comes out near Dee's Corner in Mungo Brush. And that's a fire trail, but I think you mentioned recently on your site, sometimes there's good fire trails and bad fire trails, and this one is a very good one, very scenic. It's probably, I want to go back and do it on my mountain bike. It's a perfect one on a mountain bike, But yeah, that was the only place where I'd say you really have to think about Big Gibber. There are quite a few boat crossings, across the Nambucca River and the Macleay River, and these are easily booked. I just rang up a local boat shed and just asked, do you provide such a service? Because often boat sheds have tender service out to people that moor their boats nearby. The Manning entrance, a bit south of Harrington, that would also require a boat crossing, but you can get a bus. That's one of the places where you could get a bus from Harrington to, Taree, and then Taree out to Old Bar or Manning Point. So I think none of them should stop people. I occasionally took the easy way out when I had a support crew, and I'd finish one day. For example, I finished one day at Comerong Island at the mouth of the Shoalhaven River, and I started the next day at Crookhaven, which is on the other side. But they wouldn't be that hard. I did have a pack raft. I didn't bring it with me because it probably weighs about 2 kilos. But actually, if you really were determined to do everything, you could bring a pack raft or indeed the tow float. But I just was thinking I don't want to be sort of, on the 7 o'clock news being winched to safety and have everybody say, what was that old idiot doing there? So, yeah, I kind of, again, a bit of discretion sometimes is worth it.
Yeah, I think so. Sometimes if you set your goal saying you will do this, sometimes you've just got to say, no, not safe enough, or it's cutting it a bit fine. I'll do the sensible thing. Yeah,
and look, for anyone who's wanting to do a section, I've got a blog of every day on my website or on my Facebook page. But anywhere where people were worried, I'm very happy to provide the details. And even where I didn't use public transport or swim it, it's still recent enough that I'm very aware. And really, it's the main rivers, sort of Tweed, Richmond, Clarence, Macleay, Manning, Hastings, etc. But they, on the north, they almost always, there's towns on those rivers. So there'll be bridges or ferries. And indeed, the ferry crossings, particularly the one from Iluka to Yamba on the Clarence River, that just adds joy to the day. It's not like, oh, no, there's a river. It's like, oh, this is just a great way to end the day.
What was the flora and fauna like in this trip? And again, coastal Australia tends to be very similar, but you do get some variation as you move your way up and down the coast.
Yeah, I'll misquote Samuel Johnson and say if you get tired of the flora and fauna and marine life on this walk, then you're tired of life. It's nothing short of outstanding. Doing it in weekly stages, you also see the seasonal change. And I'm no expert, and I realise there are many challenges with threatened species, but really it's an astonishing variety and diversity of plant and animal and marine life. I found I'd stop and read interpretive signage, so I actually really learned a lot about the different environments and indeed the pests. I don't think I ever quite realised what beetle bush is, and now I'm very aware of it. So it's so much effort's being made, and protected shorebirds and sanctuaries. It's great, and I think when you're sauntering, or even better still, if you're just sitting down, the wildlife gets on with its day, and it's just kangaroos, koalas, wallabies, wombats, echidnas, possums, dingoes. They're so easily seen and are just incredible. And then the marine life, for me, was the particular joy. Just dolphins. There are so many; it's unbelievable. Whales, turtles, sea lions, fish species. You see these schools of fish all jumping out of the water, and those nice, peaceful dolphins are actually pretty wicked hunters. So you sort of see them. There's a bait ball of fish, and the dolphins riding through, and then the bird life, sort of white-bellied sea eagles and Brahminy kites, and emus and urigir and pelicans and black swans and black ducks and kookaburras, galahs, just the whole range. It's incredible. And then there's quite a few wetlands along the way, and there's just cormorants and herons and ibis and spoonbill. It's just astonishing, and I don't think it's actually completely true that it doesn't vary. I know that the sort of the geology of the beaches, for many miles can be similar, but every headland's different. Every beach is different. I found being aware of those subtle changes was one of the real sort of mindful joys of the walk.
So what about people interaction? I mean, you mentioned you came across some hiking groups every so often, and certainly if you're walking along through Sydney as an example, you're going to get a lot of people on a lot of those trails. But were you coming across a lot of hikers, or it was mainly in the more built up areas?
Yeah, well, look, everyone's happy at the beach, and I walked with poles a lot of the way, so almost everybody that would be walking in the other direction had asked me if I was training for the Camino, and I just always reply, "Look, this is my Camino. I'm a pilgrim who worships the coast." And it's a great pleasure of walking, of just having all these uplifting interactions with all sorts of people. You know, I love to see people just enjoying themselves on the coast or on the beach. But apart from the name walks, Yurugir and Murrumarang, I didn't meet many through hikers, people sort of doing what I was doing. And I think when something becomes a kind of a name walk, it does provide reassurance, like you were saying earlier about, well, there'll be signs, it'll be easily doable. And I'd love to contribute a little bit to just making this whole route a name walk. When I was young, I used to have a little outdoor English teaching business, and I used to take the students on what I then called the head-to-head around Sydney Harbour from North Head to South Head, doing what now has become most of the Bondi to Manly walk. When I used to do it when I was young, you'd never see people doing the whole thing. But now, since the Bondi Manly walk's become a thing, you just see so many, both tourists and locals, doing the walk because, they've come across it and it's like, wow, that sounds good. So, yeah, but I was surprised that I didn't meet many through hikers, but then again, I was largely doing the walk on weekdays and out of season, so perhaps it'd be very different, in sort of the peak summer.
Yeah, no, I think that's the thing. Middle of winter, people, avid hikers will be out and about, but the fair weather hikers will probably save it till the warmer times of the year. But certainly there's typically plenty of people around if that's what you're after.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd say is if you want to get that really by yourself feeling, some of the longer beaches, there's not many anymore, but the ones that are four-wheel drive beaches probably get busy on weekends. So I guess if you want reassurance, do them on the weekends because there'll always be somebody fishing with their fully equipped four-wheel drive nearby to help in times of trouble. But on the other hand, if you like, really, there is something incredible about being in the middle of a long, lonely stretch of sand, sort of dolphins playing in the water, near you, and whales just a bit offshore, and you're just sitting on a driftwood log, just drinking in the universe. So, but I agree. It's sometimes nice when you're by yourself just to know that there's somebody nearby. They don't have to be right in your face, but sometimes it's nice to think, well, okay, if something terrible did happen, I'm not going to just die alone and starving in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, now that prompts another couple of questions. Were you carrying a personal locator beacon of some sort, or was it mainly the phone that you're relying on?
I thought about the locator beacon. It's one of those things, a bit like contacting the bushwalking clubs, where I sort of always meant to do it. In most places, I don't want to be giving sort of poor safety advice. In most places on the walk, because the beaches are flat and the headlands are high, you do have mobile reception in many, many places. So I never felt sort of terrified that something would happen. It's very different even to say walking in the Blue Mountains near Sydney, because once you're in gullies, once you walk a couple of ridges away from civilization, there's no, reception cuts out very quickly. But honestly, on the coast, the mobile towers nowadays tend to be on the highest spots, and so the coverage is okay for almost all of it. But I think anybody who had any worries, occasionally I feel I was climbing down, a rock ledge or something, you just have that moment where you think, oh God, is this the time when, I wish I had that EPIRB. But I think, except for the very isolated bits, I think you can pretty safely use your mobile. But then with all the caveats, I always had, my wife and a friend who knew my itinerary, knew where I would be at the start and end of every day. I'd call or message my wife when I was setting out, as often as not at lunchtime, and then would always make sure I confirmed that I'm back in civilization at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And did you do this walk solo, or did you have the occasional day or period where you were walking with others?
So most of it's solo, but I did. So one of the great things about it was I have sort of friends up and down the coast. So occasionally when I met up with them, they do a bit of the walk with me. As I got sort of in the area around Sydney, my wife joined me for a few days of the walk. My brothers and sisters did a couple of days. So I suppose I did about 10 days accompanied and about 70 days solo. So, I love both. It's always great walking with somebody. You can kind of share the experience. And I think I became so try to persuade everybody how amazing it was that I think some people just to shut me up thought they'd be better off doing a day's walk with me. But once they did it, then they realised how great it is.
Yeah, yeah. So one final question. I believe you're writing a book on your adventure. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so look, I'd always planned to do this, but I thought that it would just be something I'd put together for family and friends and, maybe sort of sell a few to other hikers if they were really, really interested. You're probably much more aware than me, but publishing is a very competitive industry these days. So I just hadn't really entertained the concept of sort of commercial publishing. But through a chain of lucky circumstances, I have a publisher who is interested. Just submitted, so they're interested, but that's a long way from committed. I just submitted the first draft the other day, so I'm really hopeful that they'll commit. But that being said, if there's anyone out there interested, I'm always open to offers. I do have a lot of really good photos, and I think that brings it to life. And I was surprised. You think the main people to be interested will be other people who want to do the walk. But one thing I was surprised about and continue to be surprised about is how many people who are housebound or in hospital recovering from an operation or people with other kind of reasons why they're restricted from getting the outdoors really loved it. And they loved that sort of writing style that brings them to the place. So the book I'm writing, it's of course a bit of a how-to guide and some narrative, but I try to write it in the second person and the sort of immediate present. So it's, you are here, you are doing this. So it can just give a little bit of that feel to people. And I think I'm going to try, we were speaking before the program began about, doing things like podcasts, but I think I'm going to try and do sort of some walkthroughs and, I think it's a bigger segment of the population, I guess, than I'd come to realise, of people who love the outdoors, but for whatever reason, a bit restricted from doing it. I've also been publishing articles on each stage of the walk in Bushwalk magazine, which is sort of affiliated with Wild Walks. And that's it's a free online magazine. Every issue has just, a few deep recounts of great walks, primarily in Australia, but plenty overseas as well. And I think the next stage comes out in the next week or two, and that's just Sydney to Cronulla. And the previous 8 stages are in back issues and it's all available for free on the Bushwalk website, bushwalk.com. And then I'm doing some more writing. The process of sort of sending out query letters, things like travel magazines, etc. And I think there's a bit of it's good timing because the UK is about to open the world's longest coastal walk, the King Charles III Coastal Walk, and I'm sure that'd be outstanding, but I quietly think that our New South Wales coastal walk is far superior, for nothing else, just because of the weather. And then I do a bit of speaking as well, and often I just use slides, images from the walk to sort of relate to the challenges that face us in or the challenges and the opportunities that face us in the modern workplace. So look, I love the experience so much. I just want to share it, and I'm really excited about the many possibilities. And I just love reliving the walk. Whenever I'm writing about it or speaking about it, and as I say, I'm looking forward to doing the Sydney Harbour foreshores, which would just be open to anybody who lived in Sydney or was staying in Sydney to kind of go and walk those 321 kilometres of all the foreshores of Sydney Harbour.
So we've been talking with Greg Keaney about his 1,600-kilometre trip along the east coast of Australia. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us about this unique choose-your-own adventure.
Many thanks. It's always just such a pleasure to speak about our amazing coast, and a double pleasure to be speaking with you with all your experience.
So that was our interview with Greg Keaney on his adventure down the east coast of Australia titled Dreamtime to Eden. I suppose that's probably a good starting point from our perspective. I had some imagination about where the name had come from. I thought he just picked up a name that would sound good.
Something spiritual.
So spiritual, or something that would sound good as a book title, but did discover through the interview that it was Dreamtime Beach, which is close to Tweed, and obviously Eden down on the New South Wales south coast is the finishing point. So good name, but yeah, I had a different view about where it had come from.
Yeah, I think you overthink it too much, Tim.
I think from my perspective, the thing I really love about this style of hike is the whole concept of choose your own adventure. I like the idea that people can look at something in a different way than what was intended. So this walk, 1,600 kilometres from basically Tweed down to Eden in the New South Wales south coast, it's not a designated walk, it's more a route. But what Greg did was connect a series of walks, or in some cases he made his own way. It is possible to go from that sort of area down to Eden through connecting national parks and just doing the connecting points in between. And you could take walks that would join you up. You'd also be able to do a lot of the walks. So as an example, on the New South Wales south coast, the Murrumarang and the Munjip walk, you can connect all those walks together. But there were some sections where there were no walks and he just walked along the beaches and came up off the headlands. So I like the idea of when people go through and do this. The other reason for Greg doing this walk was, he's a walker, or in his case here, he said a saunterer. The whole concept of doing this in week-long blocks. So he did this over a 2-year period in 79 to 80 days. And being able to say, well, okay, I'll do a week, roughly averaging 20 kilometres a day and carrying a very light pack because he was staying in hotels or staying in accommodation or bed and breakfast of some sort. What this ended up being was putting together a week worth of 20 kilometre hikes. That's roughly about 140 kilometres at a go.
It's a good effort.
It's still a good effort. But you're not doing 1,600 kilometres in one big hit. You're taking the time, going back home, having a break, doing some work in Greg's case, and then coming back and doing another week later on.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about doing a walk in this way is that in those breaks in between, you're focusing on the next week. And I think there's potential for you to get much more out of the walk. When you're doing a long walk, and I don't know for others, but for me, I'm big on hump day. So I get to midway through a hike and I'm struggling and I get over midway and I'm having a great time now. So 1,600 kilometres, it will take you a whole lot of time to get to midway. But if you're doing a walk for a week, it's not so bad. And I think your enjoyment of it is probably going to be a bit greater.
And for most people, there's only a certain number of people that want to do a 1,600 kilometre walk in one go, whereas...
Well, that would be you, Tim.
Yeah, I know. Whereas doing roughly 140 kilometres in a week, it's still a long distance, but it's a more manageable block for people. And given that he was staying in accommodation rather than going through and tenting it, it means he was carrying a relatively light pack, so it wasn't putting a big stressor on his body. The other thing that Greg said was he travelled south, and it's interesting, partly because it's having the sun more on your back and having the better of the wind conditions most of the time. But I must admit, in my case, I like the concept of walking home. So if I had have not known about this walk and decided to do it, I would have travelled south as well. It's just one of those sort of things. But
I'm not quite sure. We don't live in that direction though, Tim. So I'm not sure where you were walking to.
Well, I suppose walking back in the general Canberra direction. So it's one of these things that you can do either way, and you can even reverse it. I mean, pretty much Greg did he was going in the same direction all the way down, but there would have been nothing from stopping him sort of stopping in Sydney, which is where he lives, and then heading down south and working backwards from Eden. So you've got the choice of doing these walks however you like.
I think the thing that I like also about this kind of walking is it's the story that's surrounding it. You know, how did you decide, and then you planned, and, you know, what the experience was. So it's a little bit, I think, more interesting than going A to B.
Yeah. Now, logistics-wise, as we said, Greg didn't do a camping option. It was either a homestays or accommodation of some sort. But he is writing a book as part of this, and that's his intent. Even if he doesn't end up doing a commercial book, he'll do it anyway, just as a record of his journey. And I think that he is talking about going through and identifying camping options on the way. So if people do want to do this walk and do it as a camping option or do bigger sections, you've certainly got the ability to go through and do that. One of the things that I asked Greg about was where the pinch points were on this trail. So as an example, there are some places, if you're going to the headlands and going to the beaches, you end up hitting some of the larger rivers. And he said in some instances he got a ferry across, or he got a local boat store to take him across. So people who were working on repairing boats would often have to go out and take people out to their boats. He just sort of said, look, pay $20, $30 to wherever he was, and they'd take him across the river mouth as he needed to. He did also do some swims. Now, I don't know if he did this on the really big ones, but certainly on the smaller ones where he had a float that he put his pack on that he towed behind him and just basically swam across the rivers that are a bit too deep to walk across. I must admit, it's not something that really enthuses me. I'm happy to cross inlets and things like that, but sometimes they're a bit too deep or the conditions are a bit too flowing. And he did say there were some instances where he was thinking, this is probably not a good idea.
It's a bit late, isn't it?
So, he basically, he said there were some instances he took the easy route out because he didn't want to be the person that appeared on the news for doing something silly. So, it's a good way to look at that. And even though his goal was to walk every beach and every headland in the 1,600 kilometres, he did have some instances where he didn't follow that guide, more from a safety point of view, which is a good way to go. He talked about his typical day being, as I said, roughly 20 kilometres, and he did say he's the sort of person that gets up fairly early. So he was typically like to be up for sunrise, so he could, he'd have a coffee with him in the thermos. He'd go through and sit somewhere when the sun was coming up and watch the sunrise. So 20 kilometres in a day, if you're starting at sunrise, means you can potentially do that. If you're doing an 8 or a 9 hour day, you can quite comfortably do that. And it means he can actually take the time. And he did sound like he wasn't doing this as a speed record. He did take the time, or he backtracked, or he had a look at things that he thought were interesting. So again, this wasn't the intent to do this fast. It was to get the best out of the trip itself. Navigation-wise, he said he pretty much used Google Maps. He didn't have a personal locator beacon, but he said almost invariably he had phone signal. And a lot of the east coast of Australia, you're either on headlands or on beaches, and you are going to get that signal. Now, it's not always going to be the case. There will be some instances where there is nothing there. So having a personal locator beacon wouldn't be a bad idea. These days, the more modern phones do have a satellite connection through for an emergency call. Now, I would never necessarily rely on that, because if the phone dies, it means you really ideally want to have a battery pack with you to charge the phone, right, just in case you need to. I asked the standard questions of Greg about what it was he liked about this trip and if there was a favourite section. And he said there was one section which was an 11 out of 10 up near the Coffs Harbour area, but he said he loved every aspect of it. So on the negative side of things, he said there really was nothing he didn't like. He sounded like he had a good run with the weather, but he did have some conditions where it was raining or windy or blowing, and that's going to happen on those sort of distances. But it sounded like he got the best of luck with this. Yeah, he said there was just so much to see. And I must admit, I don't think there's any section of the coastal walking we've done where I would have said I don't like it. I prefer not to walk in the middle of the town if I can help it. But certainly, all the stuff we've done has been quite enjoyable. And again, when you're doing this over an extended period, you're seeing towns and beaches. I think he said it was actually roughly just on 900 beaches.
Wow, that's a lot of beaches.
Every beach is different, and you're going to go through and see things that are different all the way along.
And also you're seeing things that other people won't ever see or ever get to. So, there's a bit of a mystery element into it as well that adds to the enjoyment.
So as I mentioned, his book is going to be titled Dreamtime to Eden, New South Wales Coast Walk, walking the 1,000 miles and the 1,000 beaches of the New South Wales coast. Now, he hasn't got a commitment from a publisher yet, so but
Is there any publishers out there?
Yeah, he did actually say that. So it's going to be interesting to see, and if he does certainly go through and publish, we'll certainly go through and do a review and let people know about it. As I said, from my perspective, I just love the idea of people choosing to do something different. And he said that he's got an upcoming walk he's planning over the next year, which is walking the coastline of Sydney Harbour, which is 321 kilometres.
Wow.
So, you look at Sydney Harbour itself and it's very jagged sort of inlets and headlands along there. And when you stretch it all out into a straight line, it's a big area. Now, he lives in Sydney, so it's a bit easier for him to get public transport to where his next point is and keep on going on that one. So that would be a walk that I'd be interested in doing, just because I've done a lot of sections on certain parts of the harbour, but there's certainly a lot of areas of the harbour I just don't know and haven't been on. So that would be a really good walk to do it. And again, there's so much to see in Sydney. You wouldn't have to actually camp at all. You could stay in accommodation as you were going. So that'd be a real urban walk, but taking in the best of the harbour as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be fantastic.
Okay, so that was a very interesting interview with Greg on that, and I'm certainly keen to hear anyone else's adventures that are similar if they've done something like that as well. So drop us a line if you're keen to have a chat to us about your choose your own adventure. Hope you enjoyed this episode, brought to you by Whipper, Australia's pack manufacturer. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.